Hi, and welcome to this edition of Fresh Hope for Mental Health. Our mission here at Fresh Hope for Mental Health is to empower you to live well in spite of your mental health challenge by sharing insights through interviews, practical tools for living well, encouragement, and courage for overcoming all from a Christian perspective. And now, here's your host, Pastor Brad Hoefs.
Hello, my friend, and welcome to Fresh Hope for Mental Health. I'm Brad Hoefs, your host. Our purpose here on Fresh Hope for Mental Health is to empower you to live a faith-filled, rich, and full life in spite of having a mental health diagnosis. Well, my friend, you're in for a treat today as I have a guest, Ryan Lefebvre, who is going to talk with us today about I don't know, I guess you'd call it a film or a documentary or maybe even a movie. I'm not even sure, but I'll tell you what, I've watched it. It's exceptional, and I want to tell you about it today so that you're sure to watch it when it is released. Ryan, it's great to have you with us today.
Thank you, Pastor Brad. Thanks for having me.
You bet, you bet. Well, tell us about yourself. Tell us who you are, what you do, and maybe just a little bit about your own story.
Sure. Well, I grew up in Southern California in the Los Angeles area. My father was a Major League Baseball player, born and raised in Los Angeles, and then he played for the Dodgers. He was Rookie of the Year in 1965. They won a World Series that year. So he then, after that, his playing career, he got into coaching and managing. So he was very high profile at that time in Southern California and in the baseball world. My mom was a stewardess and a model. So you take those two,
oh boy,
and you put me into Southern California, and I was just surrounded by image.
Sure.
And so at a very young age, I felt, no one really taught me this directly, but just absorbing what was going on around me, I think I just learned that if I was going to be happy, then I needed to be successful, and I needed to achieve, and I needed to accumulate. So I took that on as a very young age, and I worked very hard at trying to impress people, especially girls. I worked very hard in sports and earned a baseball scholarship to the University of Minnesota, where I played for 4 years.
Mm-hmm.
I also had a problem with alcohol, which I would later learn was my way of self-medicating and dealing with my self-esteem issues when I was in environments where I felt I was not worthy or whatever. My parents separated when I was 18 months old. They divorced when I was 5.
Oh, wow.
And so I came from a broken family in really a broken city. I mean, in the 70s and the 80s, I don't know what the national divorce rate, but at least in my environment, it seemed to be much higher than 50%. I mean, so I was just with a lot of kids where mom and dad were not together. There was very little stability at home. So that's my background, which led me to the University of Minnesota. I played very well there, but my healing did not begin in college. In fact, I probably created more wounds for myself there. And at some point decided I didn't want to play baseball anymore. So I got into broadcasting, of course, another high profile profession, and had a lot of success at a very young age, but was very wounded, and broadcasted in Minnesota for 4 years for the Minnesota Twins and the University of Minnesota Sports, my alma mater. And then I went to Kansas City in 1999, where I've been since then. And so that's several years after that. That brings me to my conversation with you.
Exactly. And so just to be clear, for those of you who are baseball fans, this guy is the announcer for both radio and TV for the team itself, right? Is that the right way to say it? For the Kansas City Royals?
Simply put, I just say radio and television broadcaster.
Yeah. Well, and, it's fascinating because my wife's family is from Los Angeles. And so I have a feeling I have a brother-in-law or two that would love to have met your dad or meet you. Yeah. So, well, now tell me about this video or this film called Just Like You. Tell me about, how did it come about? Tell us what it is and who put it together.
Well, the producer is Jen Greenstreet, and her film company is Just Like You Films. And so it's really a creative way of telling people's stories, in that they will take on a certain topic, and ours is Just Like You, anxiety and depression.
Yeah.
And what she does is she gathers a wide array of people to just tell their stories. There really isn't a narrator. It's just people telling their stories. And this one in particular, anxiety and depression, focuses mostly on young adults. And I'm talking about teenagers, high school, college age. And not just the people who suffered from depression, but someone, and there's usually more than one, but someone in particular that walked alongside this person.
A good friend.
And so you have the person telling about their own depression, and then you have the friend talking about how they just were able to walk alongside and love their friend.
Yeah.
So I was asked, the film premiered in Kansas City early in 2020, and my depression story is pretty well known in Kansas City. I've written a book, and my story began in 2005. It became public in 2006. So I've talked about it quite a bit. And so I was asked to moderate a Q&A session after the film with the stars of the film, which also included a local news anchor, Abby Eden, who really hadn't talked much publicly about her depression. So I was not in the original film, Brad.
Really?
And so, no. So I was just moderating this conversation. I was happy to be there. And we can talk more about this later. But my depression has really turned into a gift from God and a ministry. So anytime I'm asked to speak with you or moderate after a film, I'm happy to do it. Well, then COVID comes, and it really affected the distribution of the film and some of the plans that Jen Greenstreet and her team were hoping for. And during the delay, somebody came up with the idea of, well, what if we added Ryan to the film? And to be honest, my first answer was no. And it was because I really felt like these young adults were so brave and so courageous. And Abby Eden, our news anchor in Kansas City, was very brave and courageous. And it was very new for them to share this part of their story. I had already shared my story many, many times. And so, to be candid, I felt like I had taken enough bows for my story, and it was time for the spotlight to be on somebody else. And I certainly didn't want to take away from everyone else in the film who were speaking publicly for the first time. I thought the focus should be on them. And then Jen and her team persuaded me, mostly because they thought, well, we have young men and women, young adult men and women telling their story, and there's an adult professional woman telling her story. There was no adult male, professional male telling his story. And so they wanted the film to appeal to as many people as possible. So I agreed to do it, and they did a wonderful job of coming out and shooting me walking around the stadium and really trying to add some color to my story. But back to your original point, I was not part of the original plan.
Isn't that something? I would have never guessed. I would have never known that. And I got to tell you, it was so fascinating. I thought, this film is really, really well done and makes the points that need to be made about anxiety and depression. It was fascinating. And then one of the young men that was part of it died by suicide prior to the release of it. Is that correct? Is that the correct understanding? Very painful, huh?
Yeah, and he had been an advocate for kids or young adults with depression, and had spoke publicly in schools. I think he had spoken in front of a school board. I mean, had really gone out of his way to step out of his comfort zone and talk about his struggles with depression.
Yes.
And so the film is dedicated to his memory because,
Oh, yeah.
had he still been with us, he would have had a big role in the film. His parents appear
Mm-hmm.
and, speak very candidly. And I've got a chance to meet his parents, and they're just sweethearts.
Yeah.
And so, and he was an only child, which makes it, even more painful for the family.
Yeah.
Pearson is his first name.
Yes.
And so it was just, very tragic. And yet Pearson touched so many lives and helped so many young adults. And as Scripture tells us, there's no greater gift than someone laying down their life for their brother.
Yes.
And while Pearson's life did not end the way, we had all hoped, I mean, he, in many ways, he did lay down his life for the sake of his brothers and his sisters.
Yeah. Yeah. And it just goes to show the seriousness of depression and anxiety, and that it really is, as the film really makes this point very strongly, that it's a medical condition.
Yeah, and that was a turning point for me, Brad. Like a lot of men in particular,
mm-hmm.
and then in my case, at least by culture standards, a successful man should not feel the way that I was feeling. I mean, I thought it was a weakness. I thought it was a lack of willpower, whatever. Because if I took inventory on my life, everything had pretty much turned out the way I had hoped, and many years prior than what I had hoped for. And yet I felt terrible and was having difficulty coming up with answers, and this had gone on for years. I mean, I have a library of self-help books, and I was never adverse to counseling or whatever. I mean, if anything, I was happy to talk about what was going on in my life.
Sure.
And so, but it wasn't I think a big turning point for me is when I realized that this was not all psychological, that there was a physical reason for this. And when I was able to see it as a medical condition that I needed help with, that was a big step in the recovery for me.
Yeah. Well, and sometimes in the Christian world, we spiritualize the brain to the point where it's as though that's different than the rest of our body, and it's not. Our brain is just like every other part of our body, and our mind is what the brain does. And if the brain isn't working right, it's going to be hard to have your right mind. Yeah.
Yeah, and thank God that that mental health is where it is now, and continues to grow as far as awareness goes. But I agree. I mean, I've always said, if my knee hurts and I tell someone that my knee hurts and I'm going to go to the doctor for it, I mean, nobody's going to look sideways at me for that. They're going to expect me to do that.
Exactly.
But if my mind hurts, my brain, maybe not as far as physical pain goes, but emotional pain is hurting. My soul is hurting, and I want to go talk to a doctor about that. It's getting better, but for a long time there was a stigma attached to that, and the functioning of the brain is a real thing. And I've always used the comparison depression with diabetes, in that if your pancreas is not working at all or barely working, someone can't will themselves to get their pancreas to create insulin.
Absolutely.
And if the brain is not functioning the way it is, and whether you're a believer or not, there are doctors, and you can go as far back into the Bible as you want. There have always been doctors and people who have been, treating illnesses, and those are blessings from God as well. And so I never really, honestly, Pastor Brad, I never had that problem. I never felt like my faith or a lack of faith was the reason for my depression. I mean, I questioned my strength of faith along the way. Sure. And I still believe that when I look back on it, my depression was an answer to a prayer from many years prior to that. And what has been given to me is a ministry now where I'm able to relate to people who are going through depression much differently, because I've gone through it myself, just as my mom, who mothered me through my depression and had been through clinical depression more than once in her life. There's a language that we have and a connection we have, having walked through it ourselves.
Absolutely.
And so, but part of that as well is trusting doctors and really learning how the brain works and what we eat and what our sleep
Absolutely.
habits are like and
Mhm.
what we're watching, what kind of information we're putting into our bodies every
Yep.
day. I mean, it's all connected.
Oh, it is. It is. And, that's all connected to one of the points. I have copious notes from watching the film. And one of the things I wrote down was something that the doctor in the film, and I didn't write his name down, but he talks about the fact that there is no cure for anxiety and depression. They only treat it. And your point about diabetes is the same thing,
Hmm.
and that you manage it and
That's
you
the word
live
I
with
use.
it. Yeah.
Yep, that's the
I
word I use.
I talk about you live well in spite of it because you manage it.
Correct.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, tell me, you said you wrote a book. What is the name of the book?
The book is called The Shame of Me,
Ah,
One Man's Journey to Depression and Back. And the title was not my decision. I had a chapter in the book called The Shame of Man, where I just detailed what I felt like is culture's expectations. And I say
right.
culture, our culture in the United States,
Mm-hmm.
culture, what expects of a man as far as image and success, and how those two are tied together, and how I had fallen into that trap. And whether, if we're not successful by culture's definitions or our own definitions, then there's this shame that comes with it. Well, my
Yes.
co-author Jeffrey Flanagan really loved that chapter, and he loved the title, The Shame of Man. So it was his suggestion to call it The Shame of Me, because I had to
Mm.
get past a lot of shame.
Oh, yeah.
And I'll tell you now, and I don't say this just to be modest, but my story is not a remarkable story at all. And I have a very unique job, which gives me a platform that most people don't have. But as I was managing my depression and getting through my struggles and opening up to others, I began to realize that this was going on all around me.
Sure.
And other men were sharing their stories with me.
Yep.
And I used them for inspiration, because I could look at them and say, well, if they went through what I went through and they look the way they do today, maybe there's some hope for me.
Absolutely.
And
Absolutely.
so I'm just using my platform as a broadcaster for a Major League Baseball team. I was given the opportunity to write a book. I didn't set out, to
Sure. Sure.
write a book. I journaled, and I'm not a writer by nature. So this was definitely a whisper of the Spirit to write these thoughts down, because
Yes.
I don't journal, I don't write, I don't consider myself an author. There's not going to be another book, although
You
maybe
never know. Don't.
maybe God has something planned for me,
Yeah.
but that's
You can't
not
say
my plan.
no. Yeah.
So when Jeffrey Flanagan said, hey, because what had happened, Brad, is I had gone public with my depression in 2006, and the response was overwhelming. I mean, I was getting letters and cards from complete
Good.
strangers thanking me
Yep.
for being transparent in a newspaper article, which led to some speaking opportunities, which
Sure.
eventually led to the book. And so we sat down to figure out how we wanted to do this. And I said, and then here's another gift from the Spirit, is I typed my journaling. And so
Uh,
Jeffrey Flanagan says, well, what do you have that we can use? And I said, well, I have 225 pages of typed journaling. So, I could
yeah.
just put it on a disc and give it to him, and away he goes. But in the big picture, I knew that I could use my story just so another man or woman, for that matter. I mean,
Sure.
because
Sure. Sure.
I read Brooke Shields' book on depression, and that was
Sure.
postpartum depression, and that a lot of things resonated
Still.
with me.
Yeah.
So
Exactly.
I just used my story, hoping that someone would read it and say, okay, I'm not as alone as I thought I would. And here's the pathway that Ryan used. Maybe I could do the same for myself.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And you make 2 points. I believe both points are quotes from you, but one quote that or one thing that you said is stigma keeps us from starting the journey.
Hmm.
And, I think stigma so often, I think we have our own stigma about it. And we have to break down that first. And part of that is wrapped up in shame. It really is. And I don't know if you've ever read The Soul of Shame, but
I have not.
it's a exceptional, it's a very deep book, but how shame is at the very brokenness of mankind from the fall of sin, or fall into sin. And it's written by a psychiatrist.
Mm.
So, but anyway, talk to me a little bit about that stigma keeps us from starting the journey. And then the other one that I wrote down was tough keeps us from brave.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I'll start with the first one.
Okay.
And this is mostly from a male perspective. I mean,
Absolutely.
thank
And
God.
we need that perspective in, the mental health community that I work in. We always have a lot of responses from women, but not so much from the men. Now, we have a lot of men attend our groups, but it's like we need a man to come forward and tell a story like you have.
Well, women, I believe, are much better wired in general to share and articulate their feelings.
Absolutely.
And so if a woman is asked by her girlfriends or her doctor, how are you feeling? They're more likely to be honest.
Oh,
And
absolutely.
therefore they get to better results quicker than we do. Now, if a man is asked by his buddies or his doctor, how are you feeling? We're going to say fine. No matter what's going on, we're feeling fine. And when we're not feeling fine and we're not dealing with what's really going on because of the stigma attached to depression, being, you're a weak man, or
right,
you're
insufficient and somehow
you're insufficient, you're inadequate, all those things. So then what we do is we channel that into something else. So where do we find our worth? Well, if it's in our career, then we become a workaholic.
We become better than everybody else, climb to the top of the dog pile.
We pile all that into our work, but if we only have, if we're playing poker in life, we only have so many chips. And if we put all of our chips into work, then that's taking chips away from other parts of our life that give us balance.
Absolutely.
Some men go to the gym and they just work out over and over because at the time it's very therapeutic to sweat and work out and look good in the mirror and all that. But that doesn't last for very long. Gambling, pornography, alcoholism, drug addiction, you name it. These are all tied almost always to some form of depression that's just and the metaphor that was shared with me, it's not mine, so I can't take credit for it, but we've all been in a swimming pool before, and we've taken a basketball and we've shoved it under the water and held it down with our hands. And feelings of inadequacy, shame, stigma, whatever, is like us taking that basketball and trying to hold it underwater, which takes a lot of effort to do that. And then when we let go, the basketball does not come straight up from where it started. It comes up to the right or to the left or in front of us or behind us. And it's very symbolic in life that if we hold these things down long enough and we don't deal with them for what they are, they come up somewhere else.
Yes.
Maybe 10 years later, there's an incident at work or at home or whatever. And people close to someone will say, gosh, what's that all about? Where'd that come from? Well, it was a basketball that was pushed straight down, but it came up somewhere. The pressure built and it came up and reared itself somewhere else. So that's the stigma part of it. And then what really helped me, and this had to do with the book, and the stigma and the tough thing are tied together.
Yes.
So I realized as a man that I spent a lot of time as a kid, as a young adult, physically trying to prove that I was tough. And then as I got older, emotionally trying to prove that I was tough. And then my life coach, Gary Kuzmic, who walked alongside of me during my recovery in 2005 and 2006, taught me, exactly what tough was. And if you think about things that are really tough on the outside, they're protecting something very delicate on the inside, right?
Yes.
So we wear a helmet because our head cannot take slamming into the ground or whatever,
Exactly.
And an eggshell is hard on the outside because there's a delicate yolk on the inside that eventually gives life. So you can just go on and on. Think about things that are really tough. They're tough on the outside because there's something delicate on the inside. Well, that's what happens to us as men. And so we get these tough exteriors, physical exteriors, emotional exteriors, because we're telling everyone, stay away, because there's something very delicate on the inside, and I don't want to go there. And I began to start thinking about that and seeing how that applied in my life. The antidote to that, antidote, not anecdote, I guess they both apply here. But the antidote to that is to be brave and to reveal what's going on the inside and not worry about the stigma, but show what's on the inside, to be honest with what's hurting on the inside, to be intimate with our thoughts and our feelings, so that someone can heal that delicate part on the inside.
Yes.
I read a great book called The Wounded Inner Child.
Yep.
And how if that wounded inner child, whatever trauma that child experienced at whatever time in their life, if we become tough and we bury that wounded inner child never heals.
No.
And we carry him or her with us.
Yeah. It's just like any other wound that we have. If you don't heal a wound even on your hand, you could die from it ultimately. Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's interesting how we don't.
So I finally realized that I was going to get past the stigma.
Absolutely.
I was going to write this book. I was going to be brave, and I wasn't worried about any scoffers about, I can't believe, this guy's writing this major league broadcaster. What a great life he has. Why is he writing this book? And I really didn't care about them, but I knew that there were men and women who were going through what I was going through. And I knew there were men and women who were trying to love somebody who was going through what I was going through.
Absolutely.
And I thought, just by sharing my story and the people who helped me, that I would be able to help somebody else.
Mm-hmm. Were you surprised by the reactions to it?
I guess so. I mean, if I should say no, because that's why I wrote the book in the first place.
Right. But you've received a lot of feedback, I bet.
Yeah, I think I'm past the surprise, because I do believe it was God's plan for me to go through this. Sure. And years ago, here's the prayer part of it. Years ago, I was listening to someone talking about, I don't exactly remember what the talk was about, but it had to do with the biblical purification. And the person who was speaking said, in order to be purified in biblical times, and probably even today, because the Bible refers to purified like silver and gold.
Right.
And so in order for those raw metals to be purified, so that they would, shiny and be sold, was that the jeweler, if you will, would take the raw metal and would take a flame, and from the bottom would burn the impurities of the metal to the surface. And then the jeweler, as the impurities were coming to the surface, the jeweler is wiping away those impurities, and the longer it burns, the fewer impurities come up. And then when the jeweler can see his reflection in the metal, he pulls the flame away, because you can take the process too far and you can damage the metal. And I thought, that's interesting.
Yes.
So I prayed that night. I went home and I prayed for purification, because I needed purification in my life. Well, it didn't come in the way that I had hoped.
Yes.
God's way of answering questions or answering prayers are always better than the way I want them to be answered. But I realized what I needed to do to heal my wounds and to deal with my depression was that God needed to take a supernatural flame and put it underneath me. And it was painful.
Sure.
What I went through was emotionally and spiritually painful.
Yes.
But in doing so, and being brave enough to reveal my insecurities and my inadequacies, my perceived insecurities and inadequacies, God was taking my impurities and he was burning them to the surface. And then through Jesus is wiping those impurities away. If I would allow him to. It's one thing as a Christian to believe that because of the blood of Jesus, our sins are forgiven. It's an entirely different journey, as you know very well, being a pastor for nearly 40 years. As you know, it's an entirely different journey at all for people to forgive themselves for those impurities. But slowly but surely, I felt those impurities being wiped away. Now, if God saw his own reflection in me before he pulled the flame away, I'll find that out someday in eternity. I'm not here to judge that. But I prayed that. I was intentional, and that's how my prayer was answered. And I can't tell you that I'm a purified person as I speak to you on the phone, but the surprise, I guess, is not that I've reached people, but to the degree that I've reached people in how my story just keeps coming up in a book or a conversation. If there's a fan waiting for me outside of the stadium after a game and they just want to share with me that they read my book and they're grateful. And now in this film, and just every time I get on the phone with someone like you, this is a ministry opportunity that God he trusted me with this depression.
Absolutely.
And he trusts me every time, he allows me to speak about it.
Pain.
And I don't take that lightly.
Yeah. Pain is a gift. And we try everything to avoid it. It's not a great gift. It's not the gift we want, but what God can do through it is amazing. And I do have to say that I believe that when the Father looks at your medal, if you will, he sees Jesus. And but until you and I die, that's just going to be a continual refining thing. There's always impurities. There's always stuff.
Well, there's no greater compliment that anyone could ever give me, Pastor. So I appreciate you saying that. And I hope in today's world,
you're being honest, you're being vulnerable, and you're putting it in the perspective of what God has done with your pain and is doing.
Well, and in today's world, where Christianity in our culture has become what it has, mostly because of Christians, not because of non-Christians.
Right.
But
absolutely.
In going through a Bible study earlier this year, and just being reminded that the term Christian came from non-believers who were just observing these people who were following Jesus and were just being loving and merciful and graceful and forgiving as Jesus was, that they needed to come up with a name for these special people. So they gave them the name Christians because they were so Christ-like. And unfortunately today, I can't tell you that most Christians are Christ-like. They may label themselves as Christians. So when I am able to use my faith, and I use being a Christian or Christ-like, I'm always encouraging people, don't look at everything that's going on around you. Pick up a Bible and read what Jesus actually said, not what somebody who claims to be a Christian, how they use it to serve their own selfish motives. But just get back to the root of what Jesus actually said about grace and mercy and forgiveness. And so that's who I'm striving to be.
Yep. Yeah. Well, let me tell you, just from this conversation, I hope there's more conversations we can have, because it's so refreshing to hear a man talk about his struggle. I talk about mine all the time. I have a very messy story with bipolar disorder, and I tell the guys in jail when I teach every week in the jail, I just say, look, I've been in the news more than any one of you, so let me tell you about what God can do with your pain. God is in the business of redemption, and he doesn't need us to perform in order for that redemption to happen. And you're allowing him to say, okay, here's a man who's successful, but let me tell you, I'm redeeming his pain. And that is what we need in this world. We need more of these stories told, because it gives hope to people. It really does.
And I will tell you, and I mean this from my heart, I'm not a pastor of a church. I'm not trying to get anyone to join my church. There's no financial gain for me whatsoever when I say this, but I can tell you that forever since my depression, I have said that I've had this, I call it a triangle of healing. And the first one was medication, which I was on for 3.5 years, and was told from the very beginning by my best friend who's in the pharmaceutical business, who explained to me how the brain function and how this medication works, that as soon as you take the first one, you need to always be thinking about when you're going to come off of this medication, because this is not a vaccine of some sort where
Right.
you're gonna feel better forever. My second part of that second point of that triangle was my counseling, which helped me to go in the past and look at what made me come up with the belief system I had about myself up to this point. Where did the wounds happen? What did that create? I mean, I really had to go in there and dig up some dry soil to get down to,
Sure.
to allow the rain to get down to the seeds. I had to dig up some hard soil. And then I had a life coach who essentially said, okay, now we have this information. How are you going to be accountable for moving forward at this point? But above all of that was my faith in Jesus.
Yeah.
And again, the words of Jesus, not my faith in Christians, not my faith in an author that makes Christianity what I wished it would be, but what it actually is. And so, my encouragement to somebody who's listening of faith, even somebody who is without faith, or at least faith in a God, a single God who not only created the universe and earth, but created you with a special purpose, is that a friend once told me, Pastor, that God never wastes our pain.
Exactly.
Now, we can waste our pain, but God never wastes our pain.
Yeah, his intention is to.
And I've just used this word recently, ministry. But when I looked at the actual, because I'm not like you, Pastor. I'm not trained to be a minister, at least from from the way most of the people sees a pastor or a minister.
You don't have a piece of paper.
I don't have a piece of paper.
Yeah,
but I have an experience. I have an experience.
Yep.
And I have an experience that I was not a curse. It was a blessing, but I had to pay a price for the blessing. I had to let go of some things. I had to let go of some people as a result of this. I had to make some very difficult decisions. And yes, Jesus loves and forgives, but he made it very clear that, he didn't come here simply for peace, that there is going to be some division.
Oh, yeah.
And I had to realize that there were some things in my life and some people in my life that I had to let go because they were getting in the way of me being healed and being free. And so I use that. I realize more and more now, the medication, very important. Counseling, very important. Life coach or some sort of accountability moving forward, very important. I recommend all three of those. But without God's grace, and without God's grace giving me grace for myself, and then eventually now giving grace to others, because my pastor in Kansas City said something that I'm just never going to forget, that if you go on social media right now and you see all the hatred and all the awful things that people say about each other, and you say, well, gosh, where's the grace in the world? And he said, you know what? Maybe we need to understand that the people that are just so angry right now have never been shown grace before. They've never learned grace before. Yeah. And so this is a story about, there's a medical part of it, there's a clinical part of it, but this is a grace story more than anything else.
It's a redemption story.
Yes.
Yep. Well, I thank you so much for being with me today. I can't tell you, I've benefited personally, and I'm certain that our listeners will not only listen to this, but they'll pass it on to other people, because this is so refreshing to hear. And I'm so grateful that I've had the opportunity to meet you. And there's two things I'd like to have you tell us yet, and that is where the movie's going to be, how do people find this film, and then secondly, if you'd have a word of prayer for those who are listening.
Oh, yeah, that would be my honor. Thanks for asking. Well, the film, again, is just like you, anxiety and depression. And I don't think you have to go any farther than just Googling it right now. And I know it's available on iTunes, but I think if Googling it, you'll find several platforms where it's available. Just like you, anxiety and depression, that's where you'll find the film.
And has it been released now?
Yes.
Is it out?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep. It is released.
Is it free
released.
for people to watch?
No,
or
it's
there's a charge?
I can't speak to all the platforms, but I know on iTunes, there is a cost, but I can tell you, the cost for watching it is about the same as going to a theater. So if you want to gather some people around, you can pay for it, and it would be like paying for one ticket, and 5, 6, 10 of you, whatever, can watch it at the same time.
Yeah, in fact, we have about 250 or 300 facilitators worldwide, and I would encourage you guys to have your group watch it. Watch it for one of your meetings. It's an hour long. And I mean, you're going to have phenomenal things to talk about after that. So gather up some quarters and nickels amongst yourselves and view that video, view that movie. It will be a blessing to you. And if you're an individual or you don't have a group that you're going to, listen, please, please, please get a hold of this. Just like you, depression and anxiety, or anxiety and depression, I can't remember what you said. Which order?
Anxiety and depression.
Okay, anxiety and depression. Yeah. And just type that into Google, and you'll see Ryan. You'll hear him, and but you'll hear some incredible young people. It was there were times where I just was thrilled to hear what they were saying, and the honesty and transparency. Well, Ryan, would you be willing to pray for those who are listening today?
I'd love to. Father, and we come to you as Father, our Father above any other father figure that we have here on earth. And we come to you today, myself included, as I have my journey through depression and anxiety. It looks different today than it did 15 years ago. But I ask for your help. I pray that you will give us an open heart to receive what you're trying to communicate to us, what you're trying to show us. I pray that you will use your Holy Spirit to give us an encounter that will make it very obvious that there is a supernatural purpose behind what we are being asked to walk through, as difficult as it is right now. Help those as they're looking for an answer, either through medication or counseling or life coach, or just at the very beginning of just sharing this with somebody else and just being open with what's going on. I especially pray for the fatherless, whether they never knew their father, or their father was absent, or their father was abusive, or their father was not supportive, that is an earthly father with flaws, but that you are a perfect father, you're a loving father, and that you were not on vacation when we were born. Yep. That you've given us a purpose in life which we don't understand, and we will not understand until we're with you someday. Yep. And I pray that people listening today, whether they're suffering from depression, they know somebody who's suffering from depression, that they will turn to your son Jesus and open up a Bible. Just see it as a book with a great story about a person who you sent to us to be with us and to show us how to get closer to you and to give the ultimate sacrifice for us. And if anybody knows what it feels like to not feel like themselves, it would be Jesus. Yeah. If anybody knows what it's like to not understand pain and suffering that they didn't deserve, it would be Jesus. And I pray that they would just use his words, his encouragement, not the poor examples of people who try to use Jesus to just benefit themselves, but just back to the true Jesus, so that he can be our help. and he can show us grace and mercy.
Yes.
In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. Thank you, Ryan. Thank you so much for being with me today. I appreciate it. I know that our listeners have been blessed. Thank you. Thank you.
Well, I thank you, and I do thank God. I take no credit for this. This is a gift that's been given to me, and I'm just doing my best just to share it with the world, because it doesn't belong to me.
I'm glad you're unwrapping it with the rest of us unwrapping our gifts, and then we can look at each other's gifts and say how great God is to redeem our pain. Romans 8:28. When you're going through hell, you don't stop, because God can do something with that. Mm-hmm. Yep, for sure. Yep. Well, again, thank you. I hope we'll be able to do more of this in the future. Very much.
I'd love it.
Appreciate it.
I enjoy talking with you too, Pastor Brad.
You bet.
Thank you for everything you're doing. And you were sharing with me that you're coming up on 100,000 downloads now. And that's obviously not an accident. People are using this resource. So I thank you for what you're doing.
Sure. Absolutely. Well, my friend, we thank you for listening to this edition of Fresh Hope for Mental Health. I know it's been helpful to you. I'd really love to hear from you. So if you would write me at pastorbrad@freshhope.us, ask a question, ask to get connected. We have tons of resources. We have videos, we have books, we have groups you can join. We have all kinds of things. If you're needing hope and you're going through a desperate situation in your life, we have free Hope Coach training or free Hope Coach available to you. You just have to look up for the Hope Coach connector. And as well as we have groups all over the place in different languages, all kinds of things. Connect with us online. We'd love to hear from you. And do me a favor, if you listen to this on iTunes, would you leave some kind of comment about the podcast? That helps others find us. And be sure and tell your friends about this program. And especially if you know of some men or some males, young men that are struggling, this movie, this film, and this podcast could really help them. So pass it along. So until the next time we meet, may the Lord hold you and fill you with his hope, fresh and new daily. I'm Brad Hoefs, and this has been another edition of Fresh Hope for Mental Health.
You've been listening to Fresh Hope for Mental Health. If you have an opportunity, please review, share, and subscribe to the Fresh Hope for Mental Health podcast on iTunes or on the service that you use. We encourage you to share our podcast on social media with your friends and family. Previous podcasts of Fresh Hope for Mental Health can be found at freshhopeformentalhealth.com, iHeartRadio, Stitcher Radio, and iTunes. Fresh Hope is one of the leading networks of faith-based peer support groups internationally. For more information about Fresh Hope, go to freshhope.us.